Nearly 50 days now since Savannah Guthrie's mother disappeared. That suspected abduction remains unsolved tonight. But we've learned investigators have recovered additional images from Nancy Guthrie's surveillance cameras.
Additional images were obtained over the last couple of weeks from surveillance cameras installed at Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home. One camera was fastened to a fence and focused on the back of the house, including the swimming pool area. A second camera showed the driveway and front of the garage door. The new images captured family members, landscapers, and pool workers, stretching back weeks prior to the kidnapping, but nothing deemed suspicious. Week 7 of the search for Guthrie and the person or people that abducted her, this doorbell camera video remains the only known image of the suspect.
For weeks, this case seemed to tell a simple story. An 84-year-old grandmother vanishes from her home late at night. Then strange letters show up. The letters demand millions of dollars, and almost everyone who heard about it thought the same thing. Somebody took this woman because they wanted money. That made sense. That felt familiar. That was the story most people locked into from the very beginning. But tonight, everything you thought you understood about the Nancy Guthrie case is about to change, because a man who spent years working for the FBI, a man who has studied cases like this for most of his career, is now saying that the money explanation is looking less and less likely. Not impossible, but less and less likely with every passing day. And that is not even the most unsettling part. The sheriff leading this investigation, the man whose team has been working this case since the night Nancy disappeared, has come forward and said something that stopped a lot of people cold. He said his investigators believe they already know why Nancy's home was targeted. They believe they understand the reason this specific house, this specific woman, was chosen. But he is not telling the public what that reason is. Think about that for a moment. Law enforcement believes they know why, and they are choosing to stay silent. So tonight, the question is no longer just who took Nancy Guthrie. The question is whether this case was ever really about ransom at all. And if it wasn't, then what was it truly about? What were the people behind this actually after? And why does the answer appear to be something so sensitive, so specific? Yea, that investigators will not even speak it out loud. To understand why this new information is so important, you first have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand what people knew, what they were told, and why almost everyone who followed this case landed on the same conclusion. It was the night of January 31st, 2026. Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman, had spent time with her family that evening. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Just a normal night with the people she loved. And when the evening was over, her family dropped her off at her home in the Catalina foothills, a quiet, elevated neighborhood sitting north of Tucson, Arizona. They said goodnight. They watched her go inside. And then they left. That was the last time anyone who loves Nancy Guthrie saw her. The next morning, Nancy was supposed to show up for a gathering connected to her church. She was the kind of woman who showed up. She was reliable. She was consistent. So when she didn't appear, the people waiting for her didn't just shrug and move on. They felt it immediately. Something was wrong. They were right. When authorities were contacted and eventually made it to Nancy's home, she was gone. Not gone like she had stepped out for a walk. Gone in the way that makes your stomach drop. Gone in the way that tells everyone around you that something serious has happened inside these walls. Authorities said they believed she had been taken against her will. And then the ransom notes appeared. Now, when most people hear the words ransom notes, their brain immediately fills in the rest of the story on its own. Somebody took her. Somebody wants money. Oh, pay the money, get her back. It feels like a transaction, cold and horrible, yes. But at least it has a logic to it. At least there is a reason. At least you can look at the situation and say, okay, I understand what these people want, That is exactly what happened with the public perception of this case. The ransom notes demanded millions of dollars. Millions. And people read that and thought, this is about greed. Somebody saw an elderly woman living in a nice neighborhood and decided she was worth more as a hostage than as a neighbor. That was the story. Clean, terrible, but understandable. The family responded. A reward was offered. The FBI got involved. And the public watched and waited, assuming that somewhere in the background negotiations were happening. Money was being discussed, and that eventually, hopefully, Nancy would come home. But weeks passed, then more weeks, and Nancy did not come home. And now, the people who study these cases for a living are starting to say something that changes everything. The story the public lucked into from the very beginning. It may not be the real story at all. There is a particular kind of moment in any investigation, in any case that the public has been following closely, where something shifts, where a single statement, made carefully and quietly by someone who knows what they are talking about, lands differently than everything that came before it, where you find yourself sitting up a little straighter and thinking, wait, did they just say what I think they said? That moment arrived in the Nancy Guthrie case when Harry Trombitas spoke. Harry Trombitas is not a commentator. He is not someone filling airtime with guesses. This is a man who spent years working as a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, the agency that gets called in when a case is too big, too complex, or too dangerous for local law enforcement to handle alone. A man who has sat across the table from criminals, who has studied the mechanics of how serious crimes are planned and executed, who has spent a career learning how to read the difference between what a crime appears to be and what it actually is. And Harry Trombitas looked at the Nancy Guthrie case and said something that a lot of people were not expecting. He said ransom appears less and less likely as the motive. Let that sit for a moment. Not impossible. He did not say impossible. He was careful about that, because a good investigator never closes a door completely until the evidence forces it shut. But he said less and less likely. And when a man with his background uses those words, they carry weight. They are not thrown out casually. They are chosen deliberately. Because when you have spent years working kidnapping cases, when you understand how these crimes work at a mechanical level, you do not say something like that unless the picture in front of you is genuinely pointing somewhere different. So what is his reasoning? Why would a former FBI agent look at a case with ransom notes, actual written demands for millions of dollars, and start pulling away from the idea that money was the real motive? The answer comes down to how ransom kidnappings actually work in the real world, here as opposed to how they appear in movies or in our imagination. Most people, when they picture a ransom kidnapping, imagine something that functions almost like a business deal. Somebody takes a person. They send a demand. Money is exchanged through some complicated method. The victim is released. The kidnappers disappear. Simple, transactional, almost mechanical. But Trombitas explained that the reality is almost nothing like that picture. Real ransom kidnappings are extraordinarily complicated operations. They require a level of coordination and sustained discipline that most criminal enterprises simply cannot maintain. Think about everything that has to go right and stay right for a ransom scheme to actually work. You have to successfully abduct someone without being seen, identified, or caught at the moment of the crime. You have to find a location to hold that person that remains secure and undiscovered for an extended period of time. You have to communicate your demands in a way that cannot be traced back to you. You have to negotiate with law enforcement, because law enforcement is always involved in cases like this, without giving anything away. You have to manage the victim. You have to manage the people working with you, because the more people involved, the more chances there are for someone to panic, someone to talk, someone to make a mistake. And then, even if all of that somehow goes according to plan, you have to actually collect the money in a way that does not lead directly to your arrest. Every single one of those steps is a place where the entire operation can fall apart. Trombitas made a point that is easy to overlook, but genuinely important once you hear it. Ransom kidnappings in the United States are relatively uncommon, and they have been decreasing over the years. Not increasing, decreasing. Which means that as law enforcement has gotten better at responding to these cases, as communication technology has made it harder to stay anonymous, as forensic techniques have advanced, the kind of criminal who once might have attempted a ransom kidnapping has largely learned that the odds are not in their favor. The cases that do happen tend to involve very specific circumstances. They often happen in contexts where the criminal has an unusual level of access, an unusual level of desperation, or an unusual belief that they can actually pull it off and get away. And even in those cases, the success rate, meaning the kidnapper collects money and escapes, is far lower than most people assume. So when Trombitas looks at the Nancy Guthrie case and starts pulling away from the ransom explanation, part of what he is drawing on is this larger pattern, the statistical and operational reality that successful ransom kidnappings are rare, difficult, and increasingly unlikely to succeed in a modern American city where surveillance cameras are everywhere, digital footprints are almost impossible to fully erase, and law enforcement has decades of experience responding to exactly these kinds of crimes. But it is not just the general pattern that is making him reconsider. It is also what has happened, or more precisely, what has not happened, in the specific timeline of this case. When a ransom kidnapping is genuinely about money, there is usually a rhythm to it. Demands are made. Some kind of back and forth begins. The people behind the crime stay engaged because they have to stay engaged. The money is the whole point, and you cannot collect money without continuing to communicate, continuing to negotiate, continuing to push the process forward. The crime only pays if the transaction eventually completes. But as weeks stretched into more weeks in the Nancy Guthrie case, the public picture of active, ongoing ransom negotiations became harder and harder to see clearly. And the silence, the absence of a clean, straightforward resolution, began to feel less like a difficult negotiation and more like something else entirely. Something that does not fit neatly into the ransom framework. And then came the statement from Sheriff Chris Nanos that pulled the floor out from under the original narrative completely. The sheriff said that investigators believe they know why Nancy's home was targeted. He did not say they believe they know who took her, though that investigation is obviously continuing. He said they believe they know why her home, specifically, was chosen. Why this house? Why this woman? Why this night? And then he said nothing more. He did not share the motive. He did not hint at the direction investigators were looking. He did not give the public any piece of the explanation that his team apparently already has in their possession. He simply confirmed that a reason exists, that this was not random, not accidental, not a crime of pure opportunity. And then he stopped talking. Now think about what that means in combination with what Trombitas said. A former FBI agent says ransom is looking less and less likely. The active sheriff on the case says investigators believe they know why the home was targeted. Neither of them is saying this was random. Neither of them is saying the motive is unclear or unknown. What they are together suggesting, carefully, deliberately, without making accusations, is that there is a specific reason Nancy Guthrie was chosen. A reason that is real, that investigators apparently understand, and that is apparently not the reason most of the public has been assuming this whole time. As if the motive were simply money. If this were a straightforward ransom grab targeting a wealthy elderly woman in an expensive neighborhood, there would be no particular reason for the sheriff to speak about why the home was targeted in those careful, measured terms. A simple money motive does not require that kind of delicacy. You do not need to protect the details of a greed-based crime from public disclosure, in the same way you might need to protect information about a motive that is personal, specific, and potentially connected to people or circumstances that investigators are still actively working to understand. The very fact that the sheriff confirmed the motive exists but refused to speak it, that deliberate choice to hold that information back even as the public desperately searches for answers, tells its own story. Something about why Nancy was targeted is sensitive enough that saying it out loud could change the outcome of the investigation. And that is not what a simple ransom motive looks like. That is what a much more complicated, much more personal, and much more disturbing kind of motive looks like. The case the public thought they understood is not the case. Law enforcement is actually working. And everything that follows from here, every piece of evidence, every detail, every decision made by the people behind this crime, is going to look different once you understand that the ransom notes may not have been the point at all. They may have been the disguise. There is a difference between a crime that happens in the heat of the moment and a crime that was built in advance. A crime of opportunity is messy. It is impulsive. It leaves behind the kind of evidence that points in 100 directions at once because the person who committed it was not thinking clearly, was not preparing carefully, and was not anticipating the investigation that would follow. These crimes are often frightening, but they carry a certain kind of disorder in them. A fingerprint left carelessly, a witness who saw something, a phone that was used at the wrong moment. The chaos of improvisation tends to leave traces everywhere. But a planned crime is different. A planned crime is quiet in a specific way. The mess is controlled. The timing is deliberate. The details that seem strange or out of place are not accidents. They are decisions. And when investigators start pulling those details apart, what they find underneath is not chaos. What they find is intention. When you lay out the known evidence in the Nancy Guthrie case and look at it carefully, not as a collection of random, disturbing facts, but as a sequence of choices made by someone who is preparing, what emerges is a picture that looks far less like a spontaneous crime and far more like something that was thought through in advance. Every piece of evidence, taken on its own, might be explainable in isolation. But when you line them up together, when you read them as a series of decisions rather than a series of coincidences, the story they tell becomes very difficult to dismiss. Let us start at the front door. Investigators identified a masked individual on surveillance footage near Nancy Guthrie's home. This was not a person who happened to walk past at the wrong time. This was a person wearing a mask. A deliberate choice to conceal their face, made before they ever arrived at the property. That decision, to mask up before approaching the house, tells you something important. It tells you that this person understood they might be seen. It tells you that they had thought about the possibility of being recorded and had taken a step to prevent identification. But it goes further than just the mask. Authorities describe this individual as appearing to be male, roughly average height, and carrying a black Ozark Trail backpack. That backpack matters. It is a specific detail because it suggests this person came prepared. They brought something with them, whether that was tools, equipment, or materials connected to what happened inside that house. The presence of a backpack tells you this was not someone who arrived empty-handed on impulse. They packed for this. And then there is what this masked individual did when they reached Nancy's front door. They tampered with the doorbell camera. Stop and think about that for a moment, because it is one of the most telling details in this entire case. A doorbell camera is a small device, Most people walking past a house would not even think about it. It sits there quietly, blending into the doorframe, and most visitors, even uninvited ones, never give it a second thought. But this person noticed it. This person knew it was there, or suspected it was there, and took deliberate action to interfere with it. They did not ignore it. They did not hope it wasn't working. They actively tampered with it. That is not the behavior of someone acting on impulse. That is the behavior of someone who had thought about surveillance. Someone who understood that cameras record and that recordings become evidence. Someone who had, at some point before arriving at that house, considered the question of how to reduce the chances of being identified. That level of awareness, that specific, targeted attention to a small piece of technology mounted on a front door, requires advanced thought. It requires either prior knowledge of the camera's presence or a general policy of disabling surveillance before committing a crime. Either way, it points in the same direction. This person prepared. But the preparation did not stop at the front door. Investigators also identified what appears to have been interference with a utility box near the property, along with a possible disruption to the internet or Wi-Fi service in the area around the time Nancy disappeared. This detail has received less attention than some of the others, but in many ways it is the most operationally significant piece of evidence in the entire case. Think about why someone would disrupt internet service near the home of the person they intended to abduct. Modern homes are full of connected devices, smart speakers, security cameras with cloud backup, alarm systems that send alerts to monitoring companies or directly to the homeowner's phone. Devices that, if functioning normally, might record, alert, transmit, or otherwise document exactly what is happening inside or around a home at a given moment. A functioning internet connection is, in many modern households, a passive but constant layer of documentation and security. If you sever that connection before you act, many of those systems go dark. Cameras may fail to upload footage. Alerts may fail to send. The digital record of what happened inside that house in those critical minutes becomes incomplete or inaccessible. Disrupting the internet or Wi-Fi service near a target location before committing a crime is not something that happens accidentally. It is not something an impulsive criminal thinks to do in the moment. It requires knowing what devices might be present, understanding how those devices function, recognizing that an active internet connection represents a threat to the operation, and then taking a physical action, interfering with a utility box, to neutralize that threat before proceeding. That is planning. Deliberate, specific, technologically informed planning. And it raises a question that investigators are surely asking themselves. How did the person behind this know enough about the systems and layout of Nancy's home to make that kind of calculated decision? Did they research the neighborhood? Did they have some prior familiarity with the property? Did someone give them information about what was inside that house and how it was connected? Because that level of preparation does not come from nowhere. Then there is the DNA. Investigators have confirmed that mixed DNA was recovered from the scene. This is an important detail that deserves careful explanation because it is easy to misread if you are not familiar with how forensic evidence works. Mixed DNA does not mean investigators have identified a suspect. It means that biological material from more than one person was found at the scene, and that the forensic process of separating and identifying those different profiles is actively underway. In a complex case like this, mixed DNA is both a challenge and a resource. It is a challenge because disentangling overlapping genetic profiles takes time and specialized analysis. It is a resource because it means the people who were in that house left something behind. They left a trace of themselves. Whatever preparation went into this crime, whatever steps were taken to disable cameras, disrupt internet service, and conceal identities, the biological reality of being inside someone's home cannot be fully erased. Skin cells, hair, touch, DNA. These things transfer without the person even being aware it is happening. And now investigators have that material. They are processing it. And when that processing is complete, those profiles will either match someone already in a database, or they will be waiting for the moment when a suspect is identified and a comparison can be made. The DNA is patient in a way that the investigation itself cannot always afford to be. And then there is the car. Witnesses reported seeing a speeding vehicle in the area around the time of Nancy's suspected abduction. A car moving fast through a quiet residential neighborhood in the late evening hours. Fast enough to be noticed. Fast enough that someone remembered it and reported it. In the context of everything else, this detail widens the picture considerably. It tells you that this was not a one-person operation contained entirely within the walls of Nancy's home. There was movement. There was a vehicle. There was, almost certainly, a plan for how Nancy would be transported away from the property quickly once the initial phase of the crime was complete. Think about the coordination that requires. Someone at the door, someone managing what happens inside, someone, possibly, behind the wheel of a vehicle that needed to be in a specific place at a specific time, ready to move the moment the signal came. That is not impulsive behavior. That is not a single desperate person making terrible decisions in the heat of the moment. That is an operation with multiple components functioning together, each one dependent on the others going according to plan. When you add it all up, the mask, the backpack, the tampered doorbell camera, the disrupted internet service, the interfered utility box, the mixed DNA, and the speeding vehicle, what you're looking at is not the evidence of a crime that happened suddenly and chaotically. What you are looking at is the evidence of a crime that was built, piece by piece, step by step, decision by decision. Somebody thought about this before they did it. Somebody mapped it out. Somebody considered the obstacles, the cameras, the connected devices, the possibility of being seen, and made specific plans to neutralize each one. Somebody assembled whatever they needed, packed it into a backpack, drove to a specific house on a specific night, and executed a sequence of actions that had clearly been rehearsed, at least mentally, long before the moment arrived. And here is the question that this evidence forces you to ask. Why would someone go to all of that trouble for a ransom scheme that, as Harry Trombitas has already told us, is increasingly rare, increasingly difficult to pull off, and increasingly unlikely to result in a successful collection of money? Why would you research a property, disable its internet connection, tamper with its camera, bring specialized equipment, coordinate a getaway vehicle, and orchestrate a multi-step abduction of an 84-year-old woman, just to demand a ransom that experienced investigators say you almost certainly would never be able to safely collect? The effort and the supposed reward do not line up. The preparation and the stated motive do not match. And when the preparation and the stated motive do not match in a criminal case, experienced investigators know exactly what that usually means. It means the stated motive is not the real one. It means the ransom notes, as terrifying and real as they are, may have been put there to point everyone in the wrong direction. To make the public, and perhaps even investigators in the early hours of the case, focus their attention on a motive that sounds familiar, that makes a certain kind of surface sense, while the actual reason this happened remains hidden underneath. Because here is what truly planned crimes sometimes do. They give you something to look at so you do not see what is really there. And if that is what happened in the Nancy Guthrie case, If the ransom was a distraction rather than a motive, then the question that has been building since the very beginning of this documentary is now impossible to ignore any longer. If it was not about the money, then what was it really about? And more importantly, why Nancy? This is the question that changes everything. Not where is she, not who did it, but why her? Because once you accept that this crime was carefully planned, once you accept that the level of preparation involved goes far beyond what a simple money grab would require, you are left standing in front of a question that is deeply unsettling in a way that the ransom theory never quite was. Someone chose Nancy Guthrie specifically, not the house next door, not another elderly woman in another neighborhood, not a random target selected in a moment of desperation. This particular woman, in this particular home, on this particular night. Harry Trombitis, the former FBI special agent, opened a door when he spoke about this part of the case. And what he said behind that door is important. He said the motive could be revenge, it could be anger, or it could be something else entirely. A third purpose that neither investigators nor the public fully understands yet. Revenge, anger, or something we have not named yet. Those are not the words you use to describe a money crime. Those are the words you use to describe something personal, something that grew over time, something that was directed at Nancy or at someone connected to Nancy, with an intensity that goes far beyond financial desperation. And then remember what Sheriff Nanos said. He said investigators believe they know why Nancy's home was targeted. He used the word targeted. Not approached, not selected, targeted. That word carries weight. It implies aim. It implies that whoever did this had Nancy in their sights long before the night of January 31st. That they were not browsing for victims. They were not looking for any elderly woman in any nice neighborhood. They came for her, which means somewhere in Nancy Guthrie's life, in her history, her relationships, her connections, her past, there may be an answer. Something that explains why she was chosen. Something that someone believed was worth planning an elaborate crime over. Worth the masks and the backpacks and the disabled cameras and the disrupted internet and the getaway car. Worth all of it. And that possibility, that the answer to this case is buried not in the ransom notes, but in the story of Nancy's life and the people who moved through it, is what makes this case feel so different from what most people assumed it was. This was not a stranger who saw an opportunity. This looks like someone who already had a reason. And investigators, according to the sheriff, believe they know what that reason is. They are just not saying it out loud. Which leads us directly to the next question, one that is just as important as the motive itself. Why is law enforcement staying silent? And could that silence actually be the smartest move they are making right now? When a case like this goes quiet, the public tends to interpret that silence in one of two ways. Either investigators are stuck, they have run out of leads, hit dead ends, and the investigation has slowed to the point where there is simply nothing new to report. That is the pessimistic reading, and it is the one that tends to spread fastest on social media and in comment sections. Because frustration fills the spaces that information leaves empty, or the silence means something else entirely. Harry Trombitis, drawing on his years inside the FBI, was direct about this. He said that in high-stakes investigations, silence is often not a sign of failure. It is a sign of strategy. And understanding the difference between those two things is critical to understanding where the Nancy Guthrie case actually stands right now. Think about what investigators are managing simultaneously. They are trying to find Nancy, who is 84 years old, whose health is a genuine concern with every passing day, and who may still be alive. They are trying to identify and locate the people responsible for her disappearance, without alerting those people that the net is tightening. They are trying to preserve evidence that could be damaged, destroyed, or made inaccessible if the wrong person learns too much about what law enforcement already knows. And they are trying to follow thousands of tips. Trombitas confirm the number is in the thousands, each one requiring evaluation, follow-up, and careful documentation. In that environment, talking too much is not just unhelpful, it is dangerous. Consider what happens if investigators publicly confirm the direction they are looking. The people responsible now know which way to run. They know which connections to sever, which evidence to destroy, which stories to coordinate. If Nancy is still alive and being held somewhere, a premature public revelation about what investigators know could trigger a devastating decision by the people holding her. Silence, in this context, is protection. It is a wall built around the investigation to keep its most sensitive elements safe from the very people it is designed to catch. Trombitas made another point that is worth sitting with carefully. He noted that cases like this can break open on a single tip. Not a flood of information, not a dramatic breakthrough captured on camera. Just one person who has been carrying something they know, finally deciding that the weight of that knowledge is too heavy to keep holding. People change. Loyalties shift. Someone who felt protected 6 weeks ago may be feeling exposed today. Someone who stayed quiet out of fear may be reaching the point where their conscience is louder than their fear. Someone on the edges of this case. Not the primary actor, but someone who heard something, saw something, or was told something. Maybe sitting right now on the edge of making a phone call that changes everything. That is why the billboards matter. That is why the reward money matters. That is why keeping this case visible and present in the public conversation matters. Because the investigation is not only happening in evidence labs and interrogation rooms, part of it is happening inside the mind of someone who has not spoken yet. And law enforcement knows that. The silence from investigators is not emptiness. It is pressure. Quiet, sustained, deliberate pressure applied to the spaces where the truth is still hiding. Every day that passes without a premature revelation is another day that the people responsible cannot be fully certain of how much investigators know. That uncertainty is a tool. That uncertainty keeps people nervous. And nervous people, over time, make mistakes. They talk to the wrong person. They move in a way that gets noticed. They make a decision that leaves a trace. Trombitas was clear that even when the public cannot see progress happening, that does not mean progress is not happening. Forensic analysis takes time. DNA processing takes time. Reviewing surveillance footage from dozens of cameras across a wide area takes time. Following up on thousands of tips takes time. None of that work is visible from the outside. None of it generates headlines while it is underway, but all of it is building something. And sometimes what it is building is a case that, when it finally becomes visible, is already complete. There is also something important in the fact that investigators have continued to review footage and physical evidence, even in moments where specific recovered materials did not immediately reveal suspicious activity. That kind of persistent, methodical work, continuing to look even when the looking does not immediately pay off, is not the behavior of an investigation that has given up. It is the behavior of an investigation that understands that the answer is somewhere in the available evidence and is committed to finding it no matter how long that takes. So when you hear that investigators are staying quiet, when you notice that the sheriff is confirming the existence of a motive without describing it, when you observe that the people closest to this case are choosing their words with enormous care, do not read that as paralysis, and read it as patience. Read it as the kind of controlled, deliberate stillness that experienced investigators maintain when they are close enough to the truth that a single careless word could let it slip away. The silence in the Nancy Guthrie case is not the sound of an investigation that has stopped moving. It may be the sound of one that is almost ready to speak. But before that moment comes, if it comes, there is another force at work in this case. One that operates not in evidence rooms or sheriff's offices, but on highways and billboards and in the quiet moments when an ordinary person drives past a familiar face and suddenly remembers something they were not sure mattered. That force is the public. And its role in what happens next may be more important than anyone has yet acknowledged. There is a moment in certain investigations where the case steps outside the walls of the police department and walks directly into the lives of ordinary people. It stops being something you follow on the news from a comfortable distance. It becomes something you might actually be part of. Something where the next breakthrough does not come from a laboratory or an interrogation room, but from a person sitting in a car at a red light, looking up at a billboard, and suddenly feeling something shift inside their chest. That is where the Nancy Guthrie case is right now. Nancy's face is on billboards, not just in Tucson, not just in Arizona, but spreading across multiple states, placed in high-traffic locations where thousands of people pass every single day. Her image, an 84-year-old woman with a life full of family, faith, and routine, is being held up to the world with a simple, urgent message underneath it. Have you seen her? Do you know something? Please come forward. The family has raised the reward for information leading to Nancy's safe return to $1 million. $1 million. That is not a symbolic gesture. That is a serious, substantial commitment of resources designed to communicate one thing above all else: that whoever has information about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, whatever the cost of coming forward might feel like from the inside, the people who love her are prepared to make it worth the risk. And alongside the family's reward, the FBI has added $100,000 of its own. Together, that is $1.1 million sitting on the table for the person, or persons, who provide the information that breaks this case open. Now, some people hear numbers like that and think about them in purely financial terms. But Harry Trombitas, the former FBI special agent who has spoken about this case, understands that reward money functions on a level that goes deeper than simple economics. It is not just an incentive, it is a signal. It tells the people on the edges of this case, the ones who know something but have not yet decided what to do with that knowledge, that the world is paying attention, that the stakes are real, and that the window for choosing the right side of this situation is still open. But it will not stay open forever. Think about who that person might be. They are probably not the primary actor in whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie. The person most directly responsible for her disappearance is likely either deeply hidden or deeply committed to staying silent. But crimes of this complexity, crimes that require planning, coordination, multiple moving parts, and the kind of preparation the evidence clearly suggests, do not happen in complete isolation. They leave ripples. Someone talked before this happened, maybe not explicitly, maybe not in a way that felt significant at the time, but someone said something to someone. Someone mentioned a name, or a plan, or a grievance. Someone noticed a change in behavior in a person they know. Someone was asked a question that felt strange, but did not immediately raise an alarm. Someone saw something in the days or weeks before January 31st that, in retrospect, looks very different now than it did then. That person may not even fully realize what they know. They may be carrying a piece of this puzzle without understanding that it is a piece at all. They may have filed it away as a strange coincidence, an odd conversation, a moment that felt slightly off but not off enough to report. And every day they go about their life, that piece sits quietly inside them, unconnected to the larger picture. The billboards, the rewards, the continued media coverage. All of it is designed to reach that person, to make the connection for them, to hold Nancy's face up in their line of sight often enough and clearly enough that one day, in one ordinary moment, something inside them clicks into place and they think, oh, that's what it was. And then they pick up the phone. Trombitas spoke directly to this dynamic when he discussed the nature of loyalty in criminal cases. He made an observation that is both practical and deeply human. He said that relationships change over time. The bond that kept someone silent in the early days of an investigation, whether that bond was love, fear, obligation, or self-interest, is not necessarily as strong 6 weeks later, or 6 months later, or a year later. Fear fades. Love curdles when it is tested by guilt. Obligation weakens when the person you feel obligated to has put you at risk. Self-interest recalculates when the reward money goes up and the consequences of continued silence become clearer. The person who would not have made that call on February 1st might make it on March 19th. The person who felt protected and certain in the immediate aftermath of the crime might be feeling considerably less protected and considerably less certain right now. Time does not only work against Nancy. Time also works against the people who know what happened to her, and the billboards are a constant physical reminder of that fact. Every time that person drives past Nancy's face, whether they are in Arizona or in another state entirely, they are being reminded that the world has not moved on, that the investigation is still active, that the reward is still available, that the choice they are carrying around with them every single day still has consequences, still has weight, and still has an outcome that has not yet been determined. There is something else the billboard campaign communicates that is easy to miss if you are only thinking about it as an awareness tool. It communicates to the people responsible for Nancy's disappearance that law enforcement has not narrowed its focus to a small, contained circle. By spreading Nancy's image across multiple states, investigators and the family are sending a message that the search is wide, that it has not settled on a single theory or a single geographic area, that the case remains open in every direction. That kind of broad, visible, sustained pressure is psychologically significant for anyone who is hiding something. It means there is no clear, safe distance. There is no state you can drive to where the case has faded from view. There is no moment where you can look around and feel certain that the search has passed you by. The billboards follow you, and alongside the billboards, the continued media coverage serves a parallel function. Every new report, every documentary, every update that keeps Nancy's story in the public conversation is another opportunity for the right person to hear it at the right moment. Trombitas has been explicit about this. Sometimes it is the latest report, the most recent update, the newest piece of publicly available information that finally prompts the call that changes everything. Not because the information itself is dramatically new, but because it reaches someone at a moment when they are finally ready to act on what they know. Timing in these cases is everything, and the people running this public campaign understand that you cannot control when the right moment arrives for the right person. What you can control is making sure that when that moment comes, the information is there, the face is visible, the number to call is easy to find, and the reward is large enough to feel real. So when you see the billboards, when you read about the expanding reward, when you notice that this case continues to generate attention and coverage weeks after Nancy first disappeared, understand that none of that is accidental. It is a strategy. A patient, sustained, deliberately constructed strategy built around one fundamental belief that experienced investigators hold on to even in the darkest moments of a case like this. Somewhere out there, someone knows something. They have not spoken yet, but they might. And when they do, everything changes. The question is not whether that person exists. Based on everything investigators and former agents have said about this case, they almost certainly do. The question is what it will take to reach them. What combination of time, pressure, visibility, reward, guilt, fear, and human conscience will finally tip the balance from silence to truth. Nancy Guthrie's family is betting $1 million that the answer is out there. And law enforcement, with its own reward and its own sustained investigative pressure, is betting something even more valuable than money. They are betting that the truth, in cases like this, has a way of refusing to stay buried forever. All it needs is the right moment and the right person willing to finally let it out. At some point in every missing person's case, no matter how deeply you have buried yourself in the evidence, no matter how carefully you have analyzed the motives and the planning and the investigative strategy, you have to stop and remember something fundamental. This is not just a puzzle. This is a person. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She has a family that loves her. She has a church community that noticed immediately when she did not show up, because she was the kind of person who always showed up. She has a life full of history and meaning and relationships that exist completely apart from the crime that has made her name known to strangers across the country. She is somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother, somebody's friend. And she has been missing for weeks. When Harry Trombitas spoke about Nancy's situation, he did not sugarcoat the reality of what her age means in the context of a prolonged disappearance. He was honest in the way that only someone with genuine experience in these cases can afford to be honest. Because false hope is not kindness. It is a different kind of cruelty. He acknowledged that the prospects of finding Nancy alive are not as strong today as they were in the first hours after she disappeared. That is a painful sentence to sit with. It is the kind of sentence that lands differently when you think about a specific face, a specific name, a specific 84-year-old woman rather than an abstract statistic about missing persons cases. Every day that passes is a day that matters more than the one before it. In Nancy's age means her body does not have the same reserves that a younger person might draw on in a prolonged and traumatic situation. The stress of what she has experienced, wherever she is, whatever conditions she has been kept in, places demands on her physically that would be significant even for someone decades younger. The combination of age, stress, potential lack of adequate medical care, and the simple passage of time creates a reality that investigators, family members, and anyone following this case honestly cannot ignore. And yet, law enforcement continues to work this case as though Nancy is alive. That is not a small thing. That is a choice. A deliberate, sustained, professionally significant choice made by the people closest to the investigation. They have not shifted their language to the past tense. They have not begun speaking about Nancy in the way that investigators sometimes begin speaking about victims when private conclusions have been reached that differ from public statements. They are still searching, still following leads, still processing evidence, still reviewing footage, still taking tips, still working as though bringing Nancy home alive is a real and achievable outcome. There is meaning in that posture. Experienced law enforcement professionals do not maintain that kind of operational focus out of sentimentality. They maintain it because the alternative, assuming the worst and allowing that assumption to reshape the urgency of the investigation, carries its own danger. If Nancy is alive, even the slightest reduction in urgency could be the difference between finding her in time and not finding her in time. No responsible investigator is willing to make that trade, so the search continues at full intensity, and recent reporting has confirmed that investigators are still actively reviewing footage and physical evidence, even in cases where specific materials recovered did not immediately reveal suspicious activity from the night of the disappearance itself. This detail is important because it speaks to the character of the investigation. When you are still reviewing evidence that has already come back without a clear breakthrough, when you are still looking at footage that has already been watched, you are demonstrating a belief that the answer is somewhere in what you already have. That a detail missed on the first pass might reveal itself on the second. That patience and persistence applied to existing evidence can yield results that speed and urgency sometimes miss. That is not an investigation running on empty. That is an investigation running on discipline. But the human reality of this case cannot be separated from the investigative reality. And the human reality is this. Somewhere, Nancy's family is waking up every single morning and doing something extraordinarily difficult. They are holding two things at once that do not sit comfortably together: hope and fear. Hope, because the investigation is active, because the reward is substantial, because billboards are going up, because a former FBI agent is still talking about this case in terms of leads and tips and the possibility of a breakthrough, because law enforcement is still working, because somewhere out there, the person who has not spoken yet might finally decide today is the day. And fear, because weeks have passed, because Nancy is 84, because the silence from wherever she is being held, if she is still alive, is profound and heavy and impossible to interpret with any certainty. Because every morning that begins without news is another morning that the family has to get through on the fumes of faith and the stubborn refusal to give up. That combination, hope and fear living side by side, neither one strong enough to fully extinguish the other, is one of the most exhausting and heartbreaking states a human being can occupy. And Nancy's family has been living inside it for weeks. They have done everything right. They have cooperated with investigators. They have raised reward money. They have spoken publicly to keep attention on the case. They have watched helplessly as the story that seemed simple in the beginning has revealed itself to be something far more complex and far more troubling than a straightforward ransom demand. And through all of it, they have kept Nancy's face in front of the world. They have refused to let her become just another statistic, just another cold case, just another name that fades from the news cycle as fresher stories push their way to the front. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, and her family is still fighting for her every single day. There is also a community dimension to this case that deserves acknowledgement. The Catalina Foothills neighborhood where Nancy lived, the church community she belonged to, the wider Tucson area that has watched this story unfold. These are not passive observers. They are people who knew Nancy, or knew of her, and who carry their own version of the hope and fear that her family holds more intensely. A community that loses one of its members to an act of targeted violence does not simply return to normal while that person remains unaccounted for. There is a wound in the fabric of daily life that does not close until there is resolution. That wound is still open, and it will remain open until Nancy is found, until the people responsible are identified and held accountable, and until the full truth of what happened on the night of January 31st, 2026 is finally brought into the light. There is one more thing worth saying about hope in a case like this. Cases break, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, sometimes on the back of months of painstaking forensic work that finally produces a match. Sometimes on a single phone call from a person who has been wrestling with their conscience since the beginning and has finally decided that the wrestling needs to stop. Harry Trombitas has seen it happen. He has watched cases that seemed hopelessly cold suddenly ignite on a piece of information that nobody expected. He has seen the moment when months of patient, invisible work suddenly produce a result that looks, from the outside, like it came out of nowhere, but which was actually the inevitable product of everything that came before it. That moment has not arrived yet in the Nancy Guthrie case, but the work that produces that moment is happening right now, in evidence laboratories, in tip lines, in the quiet, persistent attention of investigators who have not stopped looking, in the mind of the person who knows something and has not yet made the call, and in the hearts of a family that refuses, despite everything, to stop believing that Nancy can still come home. The hope is real, the fear is real, and the question that sits between them, the question that has been building through every part of this story, through every piece of evidence, through every careful word spoken by former agents and active sheriffs, is the one that this case now turns on entirely. Not what did they want, but why Nancy? And whether the answer to that question, whenever it finally surfaces, will be enough to bring her back. We began tonight with a simple story. An 84-year-old woman vanishes from her home. Ransom notes appear. Millions of dollars are demanded, and the public, understandably, reasonably, almost automatically, locked into an explanation that felt familiar. Somebody wanted money. Somebody saw an opportunity. Somebody made a terrible criminal decision driven by greed. That was the story most people carried with them for weeks. But look at where we are now. Look at how much that story has changed. A former FBI special agent, a man who has spent his career studying exactly these kinds of crimes, says the ransom explanation is looking less and less likely with every passing day. Not impossible, but retreating, fading, becoming harder and harder to square with the evidence, the timeline, and the operational reality of how ransom kidnappings actually work in the United States in 2026. The sheriff leading the active investigation says his team believes they know why Nancy's home was targeted, not approached, not stumbled upon, targeted. And he has chosen, deliberately and carefully, not to share that reason with the public. Not because he does not have it, but because having it and protecting it may be exactly what the investigation needs right now. The evidence tells a story of planning, of preparation, of a crime that was built in advance by someone who thought carefully about cameras and internet connections and timing and transportation. Someone who brought equipment, someone who disabled surveillance, someone who came to that specific house on that specific night with a specific purpose that had nothing accidental about it. And the motive, according to the most experienced voice commenting on this case, may not be money at all. It may be revenge, it may be anger, it may be something that has not yet been named publicly, something personal, something directed. That's something that connects back to Nancy's life and the people in it in a way that the ransom notes were specifically designed to obscure. That is the case as it stands tonight. Not a simple story of greed anymore. Something quieter, something more deliberate, something that looks, the more carefully you examine it, like a crime that was always about something other than what it claimed to be about. And that realization, that the story the public was given from the beginning may have been a constructed distraction rather than the truth, is perhaps the most disturbing development in this entire case, because it means that whoever did this thought about you. They thought about the public narrative. They thought about what people would assume when they saw ransom notes. They anticipated the conclusion that almost everyone would reach, and they built something designed to push you toward it. They manufactured a motive that would feel familiar and believable, and that would send attention flowing in a direction that served their purposes. That is not the thinking of a desperate, impulsive criminal. That is the thinking of someone calculated enough to plan not just the crime itself, but the story the crime would tell. And somewhere underneath that constructed story, underneath the ransom notes and the demands and the version of events that was designed to be seen, is the real one. The one investigators apparently believe they already understand. The one the sheriff will not speak out loud. The one that explains not just what happened on the night of January 31st, but why Nancy Guthrie specifically was chosen, why this house, why this woman, why all of that planning and preparation and coordination was considered worth it for this particular target on this particular night. That real story has not been told yet, not publicly, not completely, not in a way that gives Nancy's family the answers they deserve, and gives the public the truth it has been circling around since the beginning. But it exists. It is sitting somewhere inside this investigation, known to at least some of the people closest to the case, waiting for the moment when it can finally be brought forward. When the evidence is complete enough, the case is strong enough, and the time is right enough for the truth to step out of the shadows where it has been hiding since January. Nancy Guthrie is still missing tonight. She is 84 years old. She has a family that loves her and a community that has not forgotten her and investigators who have not stopped looking for her. She has her face on billboards across multiple states and more than $1 million in reward money waiting for the person who finally decides that what they know is worth more as the truth than as a secret. She has people fighting for her, and she has a case that, despite everything, despite the weeks and the silence and the unanswered questions, has not gone cold, has not been filed away, has not been quietly reclassified into the category of cases that nobody expects to solve anymore. This case is alive. The investigation is moving, even when the movement is invisible from the outside. The forensic work is continuing. The tips are being followed. The pressure on the people who know something is building quietly and steadily in the background, the way pressure always builds in cases like this, until something finally gives way. And so tonight we end not with a summary, not with a neat conclusion that wraps the known facts into a tidy package and sends you away feeling like you understand what happened. We end with the question that this case has always really been about. The question underneath the ransom notes. The question the sheriff's careful silence is protecting. The question that Harry Trombitas opened the door to when he said the motive could be revenge, could be anger, could be something none of us have fully understood yet. For weeks, the public looked at this case and asked what the kidnappers wanted. But maybe that was always the wrong question. Maybe the ransom notes were never a demand. Maybe they were a mask. And maybe the real question, the one that leads to Nancy, the one that leads to the truth, the one that the right person out there already knows the answer to, is not what did they want. It is what were they trying to hide. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, please contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or call the FBI tip line. The reward stands at over $1 million. Nancy's family is still waiting. And somewhere out there, the truth is waiting too.